Hey everybody, Chris Pearson here with another episode of NebuloCity and part 2 of our 2-part series on pre and post process editing. If you missed the earlier video, we went into Astro Pixel Processor and did a whole lot of good work there. So if you're interested in learning more about my workflow or that tool, definitely recommend you check that out. Now for this video, what you basically need is a stacked image. So you could have been working in Sequitur, Deep Sky Stacker, APP, PixInsight. As long as you've got a raw data file, you can go ahead and follow along with this tutorial. We're going to be going over a couple of key steps. First, as I mentioned, Adobe Photoshop. So we're going to be going through level adjustments, curve adjustments, color balancing, gradient removal. We'll also be looking at noise reduction, star reduction, and ultimately enhancing our DSOs. In order to do all these things, beyond Adobe Photoshop, you're also going to need a license or a copy of Noel Carboni's Astronomy Tools Action Set, which is a series of plugins dedicated towards astrophotography editing that feed right into Adobe Photoshop. So I'll drop a link in the description below for those of you that are interested. It's a wonderful tool. The other one you're going to need is Russell Croman's GradientXTerminator, and this is really important for sort of leveling the gradients on the perimeters of your image, particularly if you're in light polluted skies like me. So if you want to do the full sort of follow along, I definitely recommend looking at GradientXTerminator, and again, I'll leave the link below. So that's pretty much it. I don't want to say more. We've got a pretty good lengthy video ahead of us. Do follow along. Feel free to pause the video as you go forward to try to see where you can make adjustments, and beyond that, I'm going to try to go as slow and steady as I can. So thanks so much for tuning in. Hopefully you guys get something out of this video, and at the end we'll see what all of this hard work has produced. Thanks. So here we are in Photoshop. Now Photoshop and Lightroom, both apps you can get on the Adobe Creative Cloud. It's about 20 bucks a month. You're going to want to go ahead and hit File, Open, and pull that TIFF file that you've created, so version 3. Select Open, and what we should see here is a black screen. Now, don't be freaked out by this. We should be able to make the adjustments necessary, but let's check something first, just to make sure that we are dealing with a 16-bit file. We can go to Image and Mode, and there it is at 16 bits. Now, the background level, yes, level, the floor level, you don't want to mess with. You want to keep this as is in case you want to go back and redo your workflow. So here what I do is Control-Shift-Alt-N-E, creates a new layer above, and you can sort of build on it as you go. A couple of things about layers. You want to make sure that you're using them often, but also keep in mind that as you add layers, processing and computing is more complex because you've got more layers, more data to go through. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I am going to be merging layers, but if you're working at home, you probably want to keep those layers open just so that you can see exactly what the incremental changes are from step to step. So for the first step, we need to figure out what are the darkest and lightest points of this image, and to do so in an easy way that I've seen with other astrophotographers, you can go to New Adjustment Layer and Threshold. This is going to pull up a black and white map of the darkest and lightest points of your image. So if you go all the way to 1, you can see it's a white screen, but we're going to go to 2, and at level 2 we can start to see a distinction between the brightest and darkest points of the night sky. So as we zoom in, we can see here these darker points. I'm going to zoom out just one level. And we're going to want to go to the left-hand column of our options to select Eyedropper. And right-click that, make sure you've got Color Sampler tool selected. And you can just select any dark portion of the sky there. So I'm going to go ahead and left-click here, and you can see I've got the dark point set. I'm going to go back to my looking glass or my magnifying glass, go Fit to Screen. And now what I'm looking for is a bright portion of the sky. Now you can see there are a lot of stars. There's also the 2 nebulae in question. I tend to go after really bright stars, and so I'm going to zoom into this one here. It seems brighter than the others. Traditionally, I look for bright blue stars. Those are the hottest stars. Bright reds could work for you as well. So I'm going to zoom in here, and to the right you can see on the level screen there's a layer visibility icon, or the eye. If you unselect that on the threshold layer, you'll see an image of the star in its sort of darkest form. So again, we go back to the color sampler tool, we select that, And I typically select just off center, you know, a pixel, not the brightest pixel, but one just off center. Tends to work pretty well for me to give me a good natural balance without blowing out the image at the end of the process. So let's go ahead and go back to fit to screen. Now that we've got the dark point and light point set, you can see in this info tab on the left we've got red, green, and blue channels with a 1 in terms of the intensity level, thus the black screen. And then on the right we have the white point, red at 255, green at 166, and blue at 181. We'll deal with that in a moment. So for now, if you don't see the info screen, you could just go to Window, and then info is down here, or you could just hit F8. I'm a big fan of shortcuts, so I wanted you to know that because I spent a couple minutes looking for it when I was following another tutorial, couldn't find it. So hopefully, you know, if you're not seeing any of these options, whether it's these adjustments, the layers screen, the histogram, just go to Window. All of those features are there, really helpful. So now that we're done with threshold, we can go ahead and delete that. And we've got our first layer. So the next 4 or 5 actions that I tend to do, I go to Image, Adjustments, Curves, and it pulls up this curve, curve bar. And what I do is I gently left click the middle and I stretch here to bring up the intensity level so we can already see the white points going up. And I'm going to do that several times. You can also create a new layer to do that, but again, for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to do it on the same layer. So I'm going to go to curves again, and this is going to take a few stretches. You don't want to go too crazy. You don't want to over clip here. If you go all the way back, sure, can you start to see data? Yes, as you can see, but it's going to get ugly real quick because you're clipping really good data. So just be gentle with your stretches, make them, robust, but not over the top. So I'm going to hit OK, and again, it's probably going to take a couple more. And you can see the dark point is already increasing. We're at 3. My goal for the first round is to get it somewhere between 15 to 20 on average. Yeah, let's leave it about there. We've got 19, 19, 19. Let's go down a little bit. There we go. Yep, almost. Okay, 18's across the board and 255. We're going to continue here. And now we are going to go over to the left and we're going to select this crop tool. And there are different ways to do cropping, but we're going to go ahead and select crop tool, the standard crop tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the stacked part of the image where, you know, the sensor tilted and I lost some of that data on the perimeter. And really I'm focusing on the core anyway. So a light crop, you don't want to crop too much. You can always crop more later, but in the beginning, just get it enough to where you've got your image in there. There's no dark areas from where there's missing data. Go ahead and hit enter and the crop will go in, and you can see there's no more duplication of light points and dark points. Now it's one single line here in the histogram. So we're going to create a new layer, and we've got even levels. So for now I'm going to do another light stretch. So adjustments, curves, I'm going to go up one more, try to get it to closer to 30, maybe 32. There we go. Hit OK. Everything's looking good. So the next thing that we can do, and again for the purposes of this tutorial I'm not going to create another layer for it, but you could, we're going to create a S curve, and this maximizes contrast from the darkest points and lightest points of the histogram. Very simply, you're going to set 2 points. The first point you're going to click on the left side and you're going to drag that in into the histogram and down below this median sort of diagonal line, imaginary line through the middle, so you're on the lower portion. Simultaneously, you're going to create another point and you're going to stretch it to the right side of that histogram, and you're going to bring it up a little bit to create essentially an S curve. And as you do that, you can see the histogram begins to stretch. This is known as curve stretching. So this is really a fun part of the whole process because your nebula starts to come out, the stars start to come out, and you really begin to see what's happening. Now, you might notice here that the intensity levels of the dark points start to shift in terms of the channel. So we can see the red channel is at 23, green's at 24, blue's at 23. So as you do a little bit more of this curve stretching, particularly with the S curvature and other actions we'll take in the future, you're always going to want to keep an eye on the levels. So how do we do that? Well, we go into Image, Adjustments, Levels, or you could hit Control L. And the original setup here is going to be red, green, and blue multi-channel. You're going to want to identify green, so click on this drop-down menu, go to green. And what you can do here is you can either use the left-hand slider to reduce the amount of green in the image, or if you can see mathematically you're only off by 1, you could just put 1 on the black point here and it goes to 23. So there you go, without changing anything on the right. So that's another way to do it. I tend to use the numbers and the math just to make it a little easier for myself. And now we're color balanced. So again, we're going to add another layer. Control Shift Alt N E, and we're going to go into adjustments and we're going to do another curve stretch. This time we're going to stretch it up to just bring up the intensity level, not necessarily stretching horizontally. And this time we're going to try to get it up to the upper 30s there, just north of 38. Hit OK. We're off by 1 point, so let's go ahead and adjust the levels. Again, just being mindful. You're always wanting to keep those, those different color patterns inside the same area of the histogram. So there we go, 38 across. Create a new layer, image, and we're going to do one more S curve, this sort of astro curve. Stretch it there a little bit, not go too crazy. Okay, I'm okay with that. And that puts us just at around nearly 30. And the last thing I'm going to do, I'll create another layer, is I'm going to boost this. I want to get it up to the low 40s. That's really where you start to see more detail. Let's do 40, right on the money. And I'm just going to make one more adjustment to levels there to get that red. You can see it's kind of red in the background. It's because the red is a bit more intense than the other two. There we go. Okay, so from this point, what I'm going to do, and you don't have to do this, is I'm going to merge layers. So I'm going to hit Control and left click these other images, not the background. Remember, we want to keep that base layer there. This way, when I do the future actions, there's just less data that has to be calculated and it'll move a little faster. We still have our red, green, blue levels. Everything looks good. We're at 38. We can definitely see some of the nebulosity. Really excited about that. And what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want to use a tool that's available online. It's known as GradientXTerminator. It was developed by a gentleman named Russell Croman, an astrophotographer. And essentially what it is it is a gradient removal tool, similar to what's in Astro Pixel Processor. This one's a bit older. It's a plugin that was designed specifically for Adobe Photoshop. You can see there are versions for Mac OS and Windows. It's now compatible with Affinity Photos, so if you're using that, that's another added bonus. It's about 25 bucks. There's a free trial if you want to run with it, and it's just a real great tool. And I think for my process workflow, I like to have more options, so sometimes I don't need GradientXTerminator because Astro Pixel Processor does just such a good job with gradient removal. But it never hurts to give it a little bit of a try to see whether or not you get a better boost in contrast and just flattening out of the light pollution in the background. So I definitely recommend this as a tool if you're using Adobe Photoshop, especially if you don't have Astro Pixel Processor and you're running off a Deep Sky Stacker. When I was using DSS, this was a godsend in terms of that gradient removal. You can see on the left there's a before, and then on the right and after. Again, we've done some of that already, but we're going to run with that product. So I've got it downloaded to my computer, integrated, and once you have it fully integrated, you're going to want to go to, well actually before we go to it, we're going to select this tool called Lasso, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a hoop to select the part of the image that we want to keep more or less intact. So that's generally your deep space object, the nebula. So I'm going to go around the Eagle here, I'm going to go around Omega and let go, and then Adobe selects this interior image. Now, because we want to edit the exterior, you're going to want to hit Control-Shift-I as in information, and that will, or inversion, and that'll invert so that you've got now the exterior to the perimeter of the image. That's what you want. And that way, you're really not messing with the interior of your deep space objects. So once you've got that lasso tool ready to go to Filter, go down to RC Astro, GradientXTerminator, and it's going to pull up two options. There's going to be a detail option fine, medium, or coarse. Aggressiveness, the same thing. Presets are at medium. I never really change it. I think that's fine. Go ahead and hit OK, and that will run in the background. When you're done with it, you can go ahead and deselect by hitting Control D. There you go, it's off the screen. And as always, you want to create a new layer. Now from this point, we can see right off the bat, some of the red, green, and blue channels are off as well on the dark point and light point. So I'd recommend going in and just making a slight adjustment there to ensure that you're on point before going further. And now what we can do is a couple of different things. You could go into color balancing, hue saturation, vibrance, and there's a couple of different things you can do here. If you wanted to just change, the color, the saturation, the hue, the vibrance of these objects, you can go into select, color range, and you can actually select the color range in question. So click on any of these pixels in the nebulae. You can, click around if you're not very happy with that selection to get something a little bit more broad. And then you've got fuzziness. You can increase or decrease that to try to capture more information from the image or less if you think it's too aggressive. Hit OK once you're satisfied with that. I'm actually going to increase it just a bit, maybe to 105, let's see, 106. What that does is it selects those areas. It also selects a lot of stars in the background. But from here, if you wanted to make these adjustments, you could do that and then go ahead and select something like color balance. And you can see there's a little map here that shows you what exactly you're changing or modifying with color balance. And if you wanted things a little more blue, a little more red, just with those objects, nothing else, you see nothing else is changing on the outside, you can make those adjustments here. So I'm going to boost it just a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit more red, nothing too crazy. Maybe just a couple of points. I'm really cautious with this kind of thing. I don't like going too crazy. I do like my images a little bit cooler as well. I think that's pretty popular amongst a lot of astrophotographers. So I'm gonna select around a 2 there. These are midtones. You could also make changes to the shadows, to the highlights. We'll cover some more of this in Lightroom. But you could do the same thing with really, vibrance. You could do it with hue saturation. There's just a whole lot there. I tend not to do a whole lot in Photoshop, but if you want to, it's there. And again, with the select tool and color range, you can do that. You can also select and create masks where you've got, images where you're only focused on certain elements. That's a little bit more of an advanced workflow. So for the purposes of this tutorial, again, we are going to merge some of these layers. And now the second set of tools that you're going to want to get are products by a person by the name of Noel Carboni, who developed something known as the Astronomy Tools Action Set. This is a set of plugins or actions that can be run in Photoshop to auto, mask, filter, minimum, all these different features, but they're customized and built in a way that focus around astronomy and astrophotography, those deep space objects. You can see here on this this website, and I'll provide the links for all this stuff in the description. It's about $22 for the Astronomy Tools Action Set. It's really, really wonderful. I'm going to go through it here now, but I wanted to just share that with you guys that in order to follow along with this workflow in its entirety, you're going to want to pull this out. So once you've got it downloaded and integrated into your Adobe Photoshop, you're going to want to go to Plugins, Windows and Actions, or you could just hit Alt F9. So let's pull that up, and here we go. We can see if we scroll to the top, there is this folder titled Astronomy Tools version 1.62, which is the most up-to-date version, copyright 2018 Pro Digital software. There are a lot of things in here. They have their own light pollution removal tool and other things. Tend not to use that, but there are 4 things that we are going to use, starting with space noise reduction. So with any of your sensors, you're going to have noise. If we zoom into any parts of this image, we're going to see it. It's right here. It's sort of all over the place. Remember that the bad pixel map that we looked at earlier? Again, that's sort of what this is showing. So for the first layer, we are going to go to space noise reduction. We're going to hit the play button down here, and we're going to let that run in the background. So as I mentioned before, the more layers you have, the longer this will take. the larger the file size is in terms of dimensions and overall size of file. This is what, 660 megabytes. So, you know, the larger the file, the longer this takes. So just be aware of that. And when you crop down, you lose some of that, you know, file size, and you know, cropping can help. So here we go. And if we look in here, it did a pretty good job of, you know, reducing the background. As I mentioned before, you know, you're probably going to want to insert layers. So just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and create another layer above for our next action so that we can see the differentials. And also, again, the importance is opacity. If it's too aggressive, you're going to want to set that at a slightly lower level. So I'm not going to go back and redo it. I think that it did a pretty good job, and quite honestly, even at 100%, there's still quite a bit of noise. So I'm going to leave it at that level. But let's run deep space noise reduction, which now is looking again at the background. You can see it looks at the entirety of the image in a black-white level. It looks at the glowing in images, the minimums, and it's going to try to reduce some of that noise. With noise reduction, just keep in mind the less noisy you make it, the more fuzzy you make it, so you do lose detail in the nebulae. And that's one area where you want to just be cautious. So if we go in here, zoom in, remove that, we can see here the noise pattern before and the noise pattern after. So stars get a little dimmer, but overall you get a smoother effect. If we go into the nebulae, we can see here subtle differences. If we go into the pillars of creation, yeah, subtle. So I'm gonna zoom out and I'm gonna say, let's run this at 75%. Go ahead and get that going. And we're gonna merge these two, and we're gonna move to our third action, which in this case is make stars smaller. Now there's a number of different ways to make stars smaller. We're gonna cover 3 ways in this tutorial. I think these are sort of the basic 3 ways that people tend to do when they do Photoshop editing. So the first thing we're gonna do is click the Make Stars Smaller action, let that run in the background. This is a little bit more involved, so just be aware, you know, could take up to a couple of minutes, don't fret. You know, get yourself a refill of the water, whatever you gotta do. And we're gonna go ahead and look at the stars to see what happened with our action. So if we go in here and we remove this, we can see pretty good reduction in the stars. And if we zoom out a little bit at this level, we can definitely see the intensity change as we click the visibility. Again, as always, I tend to just scale it back a bit, so I'm going to run this at about 75%, and we're going to move on to the second level of star reduction. And by the way, you can rename any of these if you wanted to. Just double click on that level, you can rename it. Some people like to do that. I'm used to my workflows and I just kind of run with it, but I think, you know, starting out, you probably do want to label your layers as you go through. So this second level of star reduction, let's create that new layer, Control-Shift-Alt-N-E. We're going to want to go to Filter, Other, Minimum. And you have a little box here. You can go over the stars to, you know, get an idea of what's going on. Let's keep it over here. That's pretty good. You can sort of zoom in if you want. I think that's fine the way it is. Now, in terms of radius and pixels, this gives you a sense as to, you know, how much of the star is going to be reduced. You want to make sure that in terms of preserve, you're preserving roundness, stars. And there's a preview toggle at a radius of 1. If you deselect this, you can see, whoa, that's the original, a lot of bright stars. Click on preview, huge drop in that. And one of the reasons why people like the star reduction is because the nebulae pop out. They're just more visible. I like the stars though, I gotta be honest, I love them. Not that I want them to overpower the image, but you know, we're looking at space. So to me, if I'm looking at a nebula, I kind of want to see where the stars are too. It's, I mean, that's, you know, it's where the stars are born. So let's go ahead and hit OK. That'll run, it's pretty quick in the background. It'll run the filter minimum. Again, sort of it's a one-dimensional, you know, edit. And if you zoom in on any of these stars, again, you can sort of deselect And boy, a big difference there. So I think for this one, I'm gonna run with, let's go 66% in terms of opacity. And let's zoom out to see what that looks like. Oh yeah, that's a happy medium for me. I like that. So there we go. All right, now I'm gonna merge these layers one last time, and we're gonna run the final action. So let's create a new layer. And this one is known as Enhanced DSO and Reduce Stars. So we've got it down here, and just hover right there. Enhanced DSO and Reduce Stars. What this does, and I'll let you know in advance, it's going to take a few minutes, so just be ready for that. What this is trying to do is really pull out those faint nebulae as well as reduce the stars so you get that contrast, because that at the end of the day is what a lot of astrophotographers are looking for in their images. And it's true, you know, and there's software out there that will go so far as to removing all of your stars. So, you know, it just depends on what you're looking for, your own personal taste, your artistic taste. If you're doing this for scientific inquiry and you want to see more of the stars to see if, you know, the intensity levels are changing, you probably don't want to reduce the stars as much. So I think with many things in life, you sort of just have to approach it with what it is you're looking to do. So as you can see in the background, this thing's running. I'm going to let this run, you know, for the next couple minutes, and, you know, we'll check back here in a moment. Okay, so that actually didn't take too long. It took about a minute, minute and a half. And we're going to go ahead and look at this. We can already see a lot of contrast. If I were to deselect this level, what it did was it boosted the light in the background, and it boosted, by doing so, boosted those DSOs, but it also reduced the stars even further. If we were to go in, we can see, you know, the stars have sort of pulled in. One of the things you want to be careful of, though, and I'm just going to let you guys know, if you over reduce your stars, you're going to create these weird halo effects and just weird artifacts where the stars are kind of sunken in. You don't want to do that. So as you're doing these star reductions, you're going to want to definitely go in and make sure, you can see here, there's actually, it's starting to sink in a little bit. And so one of the things we may want to do for this level is, you know, reduce the aggressiveness. We could reduce it to 50%. Let's see how 66%. That's not bad. The star's still there. So, you know, it's sort of, you know, up to you. Again, I like a little bit more of that star color, and this one's a little more blended, a little better. So I'm going to go with 50%. And even when you do that, you still get some of that pop with that final action. So really, really great tool. Enhanced DSO and Reduce Stars. If you go into the nebula now, look at that. I mean, you know, here it's definitely there. You get a little bit more of that intensity now. The background did brighten a little bit. I'm not sure if I like that a whole lot, but there are ways to deal with this. We're not quite done. So let's go in, merge these two levels, and the final touches, I'm going to close the action set. The final touches we're going to do, of course, we're going to adjust the levels. So let's go ahead and add a layer. Image levels. By now you guys should be experts at this and getting these levels to sort of, you know, conform with our expectations. So again, we're going to reduce this by 1, and then we're going to reduce this by 1 as well. Get it down to 41. Okay, and then blue, we're going to do the same thing. Reduce that by 1. 41, 41 across the board. Great. So then from here, let's see if we can do some curve stretching. The histogram's still looking good, but we might be able to boost it just a bit with one last stretch to really bring things out. There it is. That's pretty red, and that's something we can address as we get into Lightroom, but you could go aggressive with this, but I wouldn't go too crazy. I think, again, less is more. Somewhere in that neighborhood I'm sort of comfortable with. Let me see. Yeah, nothing too crazy. Trying to find the happy medium. There we go. So I'm going to click OK. And there we have it. So we have got a near final image. You could certainly stop here, There's not a requirement that you move on to Lightroom, but again, I want to showcase that final step because I think it's important. So let me go ahead and do the final pieces here. I'm going to, for the purposes of this video, merge. I'll go ahead and merge these two. And we're going to go in to save this image. So save as, and we want it to be a TIFF file, version 3, that's fine. We can save over it, or if you wanted to, you could just do 3.1. Don't get crazy with these images. Hit OK. Oh, in terms of the image compression, I usually don't do any. Interleaved RGB, and go ahead and switch that to IBM PC, and layer compression RLE. It's fine, should be good. It won't take that long to save with these 2 layers. It's just giving you a notice again, multiple layers, larger file size. And at the bottom, there we go, and it's done. So with that, let's pause for a second, and we're going to go ahead and open up Lightroom. Okay, here we are. So you can remove this by just clicking this left panel button. There you go. We've got the image, and we can select the edit sliders here. So this is a universal set of controls. Just be aware when you change any of these level, exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, you're going to be doing it across the image. It's not as tactical as the Photoshop was, where we could select the color range or select the focus area, all of that stuff. So just be aware of that. I think, again, less is more. Let's go ahead and see. There's a couple of options here. With normal photography, you can hit auto. Would not recommend that. For exposure, we can boost it a little bit. I tend to go up, and we can see the histogram here. I tend to go up a bit. If you go to the right, it moves that data to the right. If you go to the left, it moves the data to the left, and you start clipping. So, you could get, I would say, somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 0 to 0.3 before it gets too wild. In terms of contrast, same thing. It's kind of eyeballing it. The more contrast, of course, dark points, light points, less you get more of an opaque look. I tend to boost the contrast just a little bit, a couple of points, 3, and I'm going to reduce this star glow, the intensity levels here down to maybe 0.15. I might even get a little surgical here and do 0.18. Highlights, again, you can sort of play with the sliders a little bit. You can see the stars get brighter with highlights and less bright without. One of the issues here, however, is you're also impacting the nebulosity. So for the most part, because we did some editing in Photoshop, you can keep this as is. Same thing with shadows. You could play around with it a little bit. If you wanted a little more contrasty type adjustments, you could do that. I might reduce it down just by like 1. It's so subtle, but when you're looking at this over a while, you sort of get you get used to it. Whites, the same thing. You can increase those if you wanted a little more pop. You could. So I'm gonna increase the whites just a tad there, and blacks. Maybe bring it down a little because we did increase the exposure. So maybe around -3. Okay, so again, really subtle. You don't have to do a lot of that. I think the biggest one is really exposure and contrast. Gives you a little bit extra there in the image. So the next thing we could do is temperature adjustments. You can make it cooler or hotter. I like my images a little bit cooler overall. Now again, we don't have the red, green, blue channels in front of us, so now we're just more eyeballing it to your liking. So these are very nuanced changes. I'm going to reduce it down by 3. You can also mess with the tint to make further adjustments. I was actually okay at 0. And vibrance. So this is a nice one. You can boost the color vibrance. I'm going to give it maybe around 10 to 12. Saturation, less so. I feel like saturation sometimes is a little bit overdone. Maybe just 1. Yeah, like that would be the most for me. Now when we go down below, there are color mixers where you can select individual pixels that have these color features and adjust them. So if the reds were too red, you could click on that and you could reduce the saturation just of the reds. There we go, taking them all down. And so on and so forth. So I do think mine is a little intense, so maybe just a little bit there. You know, -5, -4, -5 should be fine. Other than that, not really going to mess with it a whole lot, but color grading is really fun. I like these, you know, options. We did this earlier with the color balance tool. There was an option to do midtones, highlights, or shadows. So this one allows you to just select it and drag and drop, and it's pretty fun. So by pulling the circle outward, you get more intensity, towards the middle less intensity, and then if you don't want anything, just double click, it goes back to the dead center for 0. So I tend to, you know, go a little bit there in intensity, and then you can left click the circle on the exterior to just really rotate around and see what this does to your image, if anything. And so, you know, if you're looking for a little bit of a cooler element, which I usually am, you've got the blues here. I think that might be a little too intense, so I'm just gonna change the intensity level down a bit. Now, shadows I tend not to mess with for whatever reason with Astro images. Messing with the shadows just does some weird stuff universally. So midtones is one area. Highlights is another though. So let's you know, select this and sort of go down and around and see, you know, what's going on with the highlights. So let's reduce the intensity level there. Again, you get a little more red, a little more yellow, a little green there. I'm going to cool it off again. I'm going to put some sort of mixture between red and blue. I like that. And let's go down to, we can see blending. You can adjust these. So in terms of your blending patterns, you could make it more blue, more red. It's sort of a universal thing. I tend not to mess with it. Texture and clarity. Now, this is really up to you. I tend to find when you add in texture and clarity, it gets really crunchy. The stars get crunchy, you introduce a lot of noise, but it does introduce more detail. So if we go here and change to, let's say like, I don't know, 50%, so we can see all of Omega in all of its beauty. So when zoomed out, check this out, you slide the texture and all of a sudden it gets, you know, it gets pretty intense in terms of the data. And, you know, if you're trying to cheat a little bit because maybe you didn't get quite as much data here, you know, mine, I've got a little over 6.5 hours of data. You can certainly boost it, but what happens is if you zoom in really, really close to the image, what you'll notice is you start to introduce a lot of noise. So if you've done a good job of noise reduction earlier and your data quality is really good, there's no harm in boosting, you know, boosting some of this, but you just got to be careful, because again, it is universal. So I'm gonna say, you know what, I'm gonna go to like 10 on texture, get some of those ripples, just amazing there. And then clarity, same thing, you know, clarity will pull out some of those gases and gas clouds in the background, but at the expense of noise. So here for clarity, you know, you can maybe 0 to 5 without having any real impact to the noise levels. Anything more than 10, you're getting close to sort of the danger zone. So I'm going to run with 10 on texture, 5 on clarity. I don't mess with dehaze. Leave that at 0. Same thing with vignette, and definitely you don't want to introduce grain. That's intentional noise. Sharpening, you know, you can run with that here in the tool. Again, you can get some more of that refined look. But with sharpening, again, you're reintroducing noise. Things get a little crunchy. We've already done texture. If you didn't want to do texture and clarity and you wanted to do sharpening and detail, you could certainly do that. You can also do it in Photoshop through something known as the Adobe Raw filter. It doesn't have to be done through Lightroom. Adobe Raw filter is kind of like, you know, basically kind of like like Lightroom. I'll show you right here. If you go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, Shift Control A, back on that image we were working on earlier, it pulls up something similar to Lightroom, a lot of the same features you can see here. So you could do some of that that information as well. And, you know, under, let's see, effects, detail, there we go. Under noise reduction, incidentally on camera raw filter, you can actually do noise reduction, detail, noise reduction, contrast, and sharpening. So that's another way of doing it. But back to Lightroom, we've got noise reduction, color noise reduction. It's a little more of a user-friendly tool. So For noise reduction, if you have a situation where it's just really pixelated, you're not feeling it, you can go into noise reduction and make it smoother. You can see it's like a maximum gradients there, or you can come back. I think for noise reduction, we're pretty good. We did some of that already with the Carboni Astronomy Action Tool Set. So that's one of the advantages there. So I'm going to leave it at 0, but you do have those options in case you need to do it. And that's pretty much it. So from here, you go ahead and export. And you're going to want to go ahead and select the file type. I tend to do a TIFF file first, full size at 16 bits, in case I want to take it back into Photoshop to do some editing. And then under more options, you can go ahead and change the name. So this one could be M16-M17-V3.2. And in terms of the sharpening, you can leave it to screen, or if you want to print, you can do matte paper, glossy paper, and for amount, you can leave it to high, and sRGB for color. So go ahead and hit export photo. It will ask you where you want this to go. So just go back to your file. And from there, you should be good to go. So that's pretty much it, guys. I think, at the end of the day, this is the process that I use for most of my images. I'm continuing to learn how I'm doing my pre-process and post-process editing. There's so many different levels of expertise that you can have in terms of creating masks and doing things like selective sharpening, where you're only sharpening certain edges, and it just depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, how high quality you want your final image to be, and you can spend hours and even days on editing some of these photos. But this tutorial basically gives you the general overview of an Astro Pixel processor, and or I guess a deep sky stacker, to Photoshop, to Lightroom, to make these final touch-ups. And at the end of the day, it's just it's amazing to be able to pull this out from the raw data from the very beginning of what we created to this amazing collage of stars and hot gases in the night sky. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit something here. For anyone that's new to the hobby, don't be intimidated by this. It has taken me months, and in this case well over a year, to get really familiar and good at doing some of this process editing. There's always something to learn, but the important thing is taking that first step. So hopefully you guys have had a chance to learn something here. Hopefully you found Astro Pixel Processor to be perhaps another alternative to the free software out there for image stacking. And just at the end of the day, one more workflow, right, in terms of developing these Astro images. So we're going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you guys so much. If you like the video, go ahead and leave a comment below. Let me know what you do to make your images really stand out with the software and technology that you use. I'm very curious to hear what all of you guys are using. So as always, guys, best of luck to you in all of your projects. Hope you're having a great time here at the end of summer. Do what you got to do. Enjoy these final days before we start heading into the wonderful fall season and into the winter night sky. And as always, we'll see you here in the neighborhood. Take care.